All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome again. My name is Stacy Conkiel. I'm the Director of Research Relations for Dimensions. And today we are going to talk about using dimensions data in scientometrics research, specifically non-commercial personal scientometrics research. So a bit of housekeeping before we get started. You all are on mute. As a way to, we want this to be interactive, right? And so you'll probably have questions as we go along. We're going to hold questions until the end because it's just me today, so I won't be able to both present and wrangle questions at the same time. But you can go ahead and on the Zoom toolbar, there's a Q&A box. If you click that box, you can enter your question there, and I will review those during the Q&A section, and we'll get a chance to answer those. So as you think of them, pop them into the Q&A box, and we will have a discussion and Q&A section at the end. And make sure there's plenty of time to talk through specifics of questions. This recording, or this webinar, will be recorded, just as an FYI. So let's go ahead and get started. Here's our agenda for today. We are going to talk first through kind of the meat and potatoes of this particular topic. So I'm going to give you an overview of dimensions data. I imagine it might be a bit new to some of you, and dimensions is kind of a departure in terms of your typical ANI database. So I'll talk through kind of what indicators are available to study, what kind of outputs we index, and then the relationships that the data offers between various outputs and indicators. Oops, sorry. Then we will, sorry, technical difficulties this morning. Then we're going to go ahead and talk about the Dimensions Plus web app and the Dimensions API. These are two different methods by which you can get data in order to study. Then I'm going to do a couple of plugs. One is I want to talk through some opportunities for collaboration that are available. We are a very open-minded company in the way that we're open to relationships and really interested in fostering new collaborations. So I'll talk about some opportunities there. And then the question that I'm sure is at the top of everyone's mind is, how do you get no-cost access for research to dimensions? Then, as I said, we'll have ample time for answering any of those questions that you have. So let's go ahead and move right along. I'm first going to give a brief overview of the data that's available for analysis in dimensions. I'm going to talk a bit about our philosophy in creating this data and constructing our data graph and why we include what we include in dimensions. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the metrics and the outputs that can be studied. And I'll talk about how dimensions data relates to each other and how you can use that to map the structures of science. So, in a nutshell, our approach to how we include data in dimensions and what we choose to include, it could just be characterized by the word inclusive. So that means that, you know, we're not excluding research based on some arbitrary content selection process. We consider dimensions to be a database, not a judgment call. You as the user, as the researcher, should be able to make decisions in order to filter out whatever info you don't want, but basically, we want to have the information available and there to study if you do want to look at it. Because we are making that kind of a call with it, Dimensions contains a lot more records than your traditional ANI database. So we have around just under 100 million publication records alone, and we also include other information like grants information and so on. I'll dig more into that in a moment. But due to, you know, our inclusive approach, we have a lot more data available to study. And we consider our role really to be to provide those tools that you need in order to make the coverage decisions and select the data that you need, not what we think you need. So very briefly, here's how our data graph was initially constructed. So we have gotten our metadata from a variety of sources, many of which are open, and we're very thankful to the community. And that's one of the reasons why we run this no-cost research access program, is because we benefited from open data, and we think the community should benefit in turn from the enrichment that we offer for the data. speaking of which, that is the second step to building this publications backbone, as we've increased discoverability by kind of enriching and interlinking the data. The methods that we use are fairly niche, so I'm not going to get into it on today's call, but if you do have questions about that, we can try to answer those during the Q&A section, or you can just simply email me. I'll have my email available at the end of this presentation. So from this enriched data, there are a number of indicators that are available. So here's a brief list. This is not at all comprehensive, but here's some of the metrics that are available for scientometrics analysis. So you've got citation-based data like time cited and citation recency, also normalized metrics like the RCR and the FCR. Then there's very basic altmetrics data. So we've got the altmetric attention score. You can also look at the median altmetric attention score for groups of publications. Then there's other indicators like counts of research objects like grants and policy documents. You could also look at aggregated funding data, amount awarded per grant. And this data can be used in a variety of ways. This is one example that we suggest to folks. Developing new innovative composite indicators. So this is a composite indicator that we created as kind of a proof of concept for a research report that we recently did. So we took the number of publications per grant and proposed that as a potential indicator that you might use in order to understand the overall influence or impact of the work that's being produced at an institution. So that's the kind of data that you can, how you can use the data. That is. So this leads us to outputs, the research objects that are created during the course of scholarship. Dimensions includes publications data for around 98 million papers and other types of publications like books and book chapters. Some of this information that you can study about publications includes their open access status, related supporting grants, citation networks, and subjects. We also have a huge amount of grants data available to study. Much of this is sourced from our direct relationship with funders. We have a lot of useful related information like award amounts, related publications, and subject areas. Then there's patents. We index over 37 million patents, and we have a number of data features available to study, things like funders, countries, and subject areas. And we have over 440,000 clinical trials from countries worldwide. This includes the data that you can study, includes related grants, conditions, and even sponsors and collaborators, which is a really useful bit of information to help study industry-university relationships. And finally, our latest policy source, or latest data source, is policy documents. These are nicely linked to publication records, and they can help us to understand the relationship between public policy and research. And so that brings me to the last topic for this initial overview of the data, the relationships between content and dimensions. So our data is structured in such a way that we make visible these links that exist between different kinds of content sources. And that means that there are over 1 billion connections available to study to understand the structures of science. As 1 billion connections as of January 2019, this is changing daily. This is really an incredible citation graph, one that we're really excited to be able to open up to the community to study. This graph alone is going to continue to evolve over time. And with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the first method you could use to access Dimensions data, that is using Dimensions Plus and Dimensions Analytics for research. So the data in Dimensions in the web app is available for searching in the browser using Dimensions Plus and Dimensions Analytics. We see here on the left, there are a number of filters you can use to apply to search queries to, again, filter out the unnecessary, unwanted data and hone in on the content that you specifically want to study. Search bar we see at the top. There's also advanced search options like Boolean operators that you can use. You can also choose what kind of data you want to look at in this middle panel where you see publications, grants, patents, clinical trials. This allows you to kind of click through and explore the different outputs that are available there. And there's this interactive curtain pane on the right-hand side, the analytical views, which allow you to drill down into things like research categories, source titles, universities, and so on in order to look at various types of interactive visualizations and such for the data. We've got heat maps, times plots for looking at data over time, things like that. There have been some recent updates to our web app that will, I'm sure, be of interest to all of you. So one is we've updated the open access color categorization. So we partnered with Unpaywall, and we get the data from a few other sources as well to categorize the openness of content in our database. So if you want to study open access, this is, I think, a really rich data source with which to do it. So in the web app, you can get it very basic gold, green accepted, green published, or closed access. Via the API, there's a bit more nuance to the categorizations there. So we categorize things like, is it bronze open access, that is free to read, or is it hybrid, and so on. We also recently added additional support for VOS Viewer and Sitespace. So these are two applications that a lot of scientometricians use, and I'm sure many on the call today will already be familiar with. These are used to map and visualize networks of co-authors, networks of co-citations, things like that, to really showcase relationships between whether it's authors or papers, various kinds of intellectual associations that exist via the published literature, essentially. So when we launched, within a few months after launch, we added support for data export. You can, from the web app, export for bibliographic mapping software as one of the options for saving your searches. And initially, we supported co-authorship information, citation information, and then bibliographic coupling data. Now we've added additional information that allow you to perform co-citation analyses and also look at term co-occurrence. And this is only using terms that appear in titles, but this is still, I think, going to be useful to many of you in terms of the research that you do. And then finally, just to showcase Sitespace. Sitespace is another research team and partner with whom we've worked fairly closely in order to make sure that the data we make available in our bibliographic mapping export data source is very useful. And I highly recommend you check out both Sitespace and VOS Viewer. These are free software that are available to download just from university websites. So I would check those out. So moving right along, let's talk about using the API for research. So if any of you have heard me talk about the Dimensions API in the last few months, you probably heard me throw around the word powerful a lot. And this is definitely a descriptor that I think is very, very accurate. As someone who dabbles in scientometrics research myself, I have found working with the Dimensions API to be really, really useful and powerful. And I wish all APIs worked like this. So the Dimensions API was essentially designed to allow very flexible use of the enriched data. And again, it's designed to allow you to only have to make requests of dimensions for data that you actually need and want. So I'll talk more about what that looks like in a moment, but basically the API was designed so that you can export this data in JSON format and use it in whatever programs or code, things like that, that you use to analyze data. So we built this with a querying language called Dimension Search Language, and this has been created and documented specifically for dimensions. It's very simple. It allows non-specialists or beginners to pretty quickly get the hang of making advanced queries of the Dimensions API. In some cases, queries that you can't necessarily make via the web interface. So that's one really nice aspect of the API. So as I said, this is a powerful querying language. It's fairly simple. So this is the most simple of all of the API requests you can make. You can say search publications and return publications in Dimensions. So what this would give you back is a list of the most recent publications added to Dimensions and all of the data associated with those publications, including co-authorships, institutional affiliations, subject areas, things like that. You can add more complexity by including filters for your search query. So if I want to not only search publications, but I want to search them for a specific term, I can do that. I can say I want to filter out everything except for content published between 2015 and 2017, and give me back all the data you have for that particular search query. You can finally use custom field sets in order to say, give me back only a specific kind of information about the search query that I just ran. So in this example here, you would run that same search query, but you would only get back the titles of the papers and their related DOIs. So if we were to talk about kind of what that looks like as a concept, how these calls are made, we take a fairly different approach than many APIs do in terms of how we expect you as a researcher to make a call. So with a standard API, you would make a call, get back a bunch of data, then you would kind of carve out the data that you needed and select and analyze just the data that you needed in order to get your overall data available for analysis. But that would require a lot of work on your end to get rid of things that you don't need. But how we've constructed the Dimensions API is so that you ask very specifically what you need up front. Then you call our API, and then you get back exactly what you need. So take an analytical approach to building the API. There have been some recent updates to the API that are probably of interest and of use to you. So we've added some new fields for content sources, the most interesting of which to folks on this call, I think, will probably be the publisher field. So it's now possible to do publisher level analyses for some of the data that we provide. We've also recently replaced the author search field with the researcher search field. So this allows you to not only search for a author of publications, right? But because authors, that is researchers, don't only author papers, but they also write grants, they also run clinical trials. By making that term more general, switching from authors to researchers, you can now search across grants and clinical trials as well in the same exact way. And the final thing I wanted to point out is that we now have a indicators cookbook that's available in the Dimensions API documentation that have a number of new indicators and how to create these indicators for any given search query you run across the Dimensions API. So everything is described in this indicator cookbook, which you can download from the Dimensions documentation. I will admit the Dimensions documentation as a Google search phrase is a little hard to search for. So I'll be sending out the link to this and a few other resources to all of you who have registered once we follow up. So now let's talk about opportunities for collaboration. So I hope you've gotten the sense in the last 20 minutes or so as I've gone through this presentation, I hope you've gotten the sense that we consider ourselves to be a fairly open company. So we're constantly open to new data, new ideas, and also new partnerships. And this has led to some really great partnerships so far, if I may say so. We've had the opportunity to partner with research teams and institutes and even individual researchers to do things that are of benefit to the scientometrics community. So that VOS viewer and SiteSpace integrations that I was talking about before, those are two collaborations that I think are really going to benefit the community long term. We've also worked hand in hand with folks to do things like refine the RCR, the relative citation ratio, and how we calculate the field citation ratio. We've worked with the scientometrics community in order to refine these metrics because we believe ourselves to be the keepers and the arbiters and the experts of the data. And we leave the indicator development to the experts within the scientometrics community. We don't think it's our place to develop any kind of citation-based metrics. We work hand in hand with the community to vet and introduce new metrics to all the services that we provide. So if you are working on a project, you're thinking big, you're looking at new indicator development, you want to talk about how to integrate dimensions data into an app you're developing, please do get in touch. My email is here on the screen. We'll be happy to hear from you and discuss what our options are. And now let's talk about no-cost research access. So what kind of projects are eligible for no-cost access to dimensions? Well, these projects must be personal in nature, they must be non-commercial in nature, and they must be limited in duration. So Dimensions no-cost access is intended for you as an individual scientometrics researcher to do a scientometrics study that is really intended to just add to the knowledge that's out there in the peer-reviewed literature about the structures of science or how scholars communicate and so on. It's intended for individuals doing research, not organizations doing reporting. We'd consider that organizations doing reporting to be a commercial interest, even if you are a nonprofit organization, because those are the sorts of case studies and use cases where we sell products that meet that need, and we're willing to work with the community and work with individual organizations to make those partnerships happen. But eligible projects really are personal and non-commercial in nature, and they're also limited in duration. So if you apply for no-cost access, you have to have a specific project in mind, and you really only, in most cases, we give 6 months access initially. We can extend that on a case-by-case basis to longer-term access, but by and large, most people only need access to dimensions in order to pull data over a shorter period of time than 6 months. So we grant 6 months as a default. This is what the process looks like to getting no-cost research access. So you would fill out a form, we would review your application, and if you are eligible, we would send you a no-cost license agreement. You would sign and return that agreement, and then we would set you up with your account. And this is all fairly straightforward. We might come back to you at certain points to ask you more questions about your project, to get clarification on who your collaborators are, things like that. We do review every application fairly carefully, and we talk about each application as a team. So while this is a straightforward process on paper, it can take a few weeks, even upwards of a month or two, in order for us to really sit with applications and review them. So please be aware of that and build that into your personal timeline when you're requesting access for a research project. So of course, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? We do ask for a few things in return. We ask that you would contact us with questions that you have about our data or our coverage prior to publishing or presenting anything publicly. We are a fairly new database. We're a new kid on the block. We've been around for a little over a year. So the intricacies and unique little aspects of our data, it's not well known necessarily yet. People sometimes don't know the full scope of kind of how our database is constructed, what our coverage is, things like that. So if you have questions or if you find things that you think are limitations to our data, we would highly encourage, we would ask you to get in contact with us to clarify if there are any issues that we know about that could help explain why you are encountering the issues that you are as you go through your analysis. Because in some cases, it's just about asking the right questions of the API or using the web app in a certain way that actually gets you all of the data that you need. But in other cases, we might have limitations to our data or gaps in our coverage. And that's where we would ask you to offer us constructive criticism. We are constantly improving what we do and the data that we collect and how we make it available. So we appreciate when the community comes to us to offer constructive criticism and allows us time to kind of address these concerns prior to publication. We also ask that you acknowledge dimensions and the data that we've provided in all related publications and papers and posters and so on that you produce based on our data. So in addition to, just writing about dimensions in the methods section of your paper, we'd really appreciate you actually calling out dimensions in the acknowledgement section of your paper as well. Things like that we really truly appreciate, and it helps us in so much as you are helping to spread word of mouth about dimensions. So please keep that in mind. We also ask that you tell us when you've published something or you're presenting something. We love to help boost the signal of research that's done using our data. So we would, tweet out links and promote your work to people who are in the Dimensions community. And finally, we ask that you reach out if you want to collaborate on a research project. So we have collaborations not only in the commercial sense with the community where we're developing indicators for putting in our products, but we're also digital science. There's a lot of us who do scientometrics research and really love working on projects with the community. So if you've got an interesting project, you want to collaborate, please do reach out to us. You can just email support@dimensions.ai. You can email me and I'll put you in touch with the right people. We think of these no-cost licensing agreements that we set up with the community as really the start of a relationship and not just a transaction. It sounds a bit hokey, but it's true. We're really interested in building relationships with the community, continuing the good work and supporting the great work of the scientometrics community. So even if you're not yet ready for applying for no-cost access, let's say you want to stay abreast of what we're doing at Dimensions, but you don't have a specific project in mind that you want to get access for just yet, you can sign up for the Dimensions Scientometrics user group. We send out quarterly emails and we run quarterly community calls, which are optional to attend, but that are really useful to get an update on what new data developments and product developments we've done that are of relevance to you as a researcher. And we also invite researchers who have worked with our data to kind of talk about what they've done, how they've used our database, maybe workarounds they've used in order to ask interesting questions or do creative data visualizations with our data. So there's a lot of good stuff that is coming out of the Scientometrics user group so far this year. We're going to continue to do interesting things. You should also save the date if you plan to be at ISSI 2019 in Rome in September. We will be there. We're hoping to host a community get-together along with altmetrics researchers to kind of have people get together, have coffee, talk about the research we're doing, present interesting things, and generally get to know each other.